like you are in a season of testing? And you ever wonder, when is that testing going to end? One of the things I have found, that all testing has a purpose. It is to draw us closer to the Lord. Last Sunday afternoon, I got a call from a longtime friend named John. Now, I call him Squally, and he calls me Grasshopper. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. John told me he was struggling with his faith. He said he'd always been told that God doesn't give us more than we can handle, and that his entire life has been filled with one challenge after another, and he's only beginning to doubt God's goodness, at least towards him. And he wondered, how much more do I have to endure? I met John almost 30 years ago. He and his sister Heidi moved here from Ohio to attend school. Heidi at FSU and John at TCC. The parents had always required them to get a job whenever they went to a new school. Well, John came into the gym I worked at and asked the owner for a job, which doesn't seem like a big deal, does it? But you see, John is only 4 feet 2 inches tall. He could not see over the counter. John and his sister Heidi are both dwarfs. They have a bone growth disorder that results in dwarfism due to a genetic mutation in both the arms and the legs. The average stature reaches a little less than 4 feet 10 inches. Now, generally, if you have that, you're going to have a long life. There's just going to be some disadvantages. Well, the owner of the gym gave John a job, and he fit right in with the rest of the gym rats. They had a stool they brought up there for him, and when he walked in, you did not know he was 4'2", because he's standing up on a stool that had him up, towering right there eye to eye with everybody. Heidi has pretty much had a normal life. John, on the other hand, has endured more surgeries than probably all of ours combined total. More than 30 that he has counted. The surgeries he's gotten used to. But what he and Heidi are facing now, he said, is the most difficult thing they've encountered. Just over 2 years ago, their mother died after a long bout with Alzheimer's. Now their dad, John Sr., has been diagnosed with Lewy body dementia, and they're in the process of having to place him in an assisted living facility. It also looks like Squally is going to have to go into an assisted facility himself because of his health needs. He can't really live on his own. Now, he and I grew close over the years. He actually worked as my assistant at the Parole Commission for a couple of years before we moved to Tucson, where the climate was better for his health. I called little John Squally because when he got mad, he was like a tempest in a teapot. This guy was fierce. He called me Grasshopper because several years ago, Linda wanted us to go take some Tai Chi classes when the studio was down on Northman Road. And if you remember the place, it had this big picture window. What I didn't know on one evening when we were there, John was sitting across the street in the parking lot with his binoculars and watching us try to do the exercise, laughing the entire time. The next morning when he came to work, he walked into my office and said, "Grasshopper, how was your class?" That day I became Grasshopper, and he had a hat with that put on it. You see, if your friend doesn't have a nickname, he's really not your friend, just an acquaintance. That's a long introduction, but you need to understand the relationship that exists here. The passage John spoke of is 1 Corinthians 10:13. And it says this: "The temptations in your life are no different from what others experience, and God is faithful. He will not allow the temptation to be more than you can stand. When you're tempted or tested, he will show you a way out so that you can endure." I told Squally that this wasn't about our own ability to handle everything that came our way. It was about God's grace, his enabling and equipping power, and through that we can endure what we are facing, but we don't escape it. And that was when God gives us a test. I told him, if he gives us a test, it is always designed for us to pass it with his help. He never gives us a test for us to fail at. Squally's mom and dad had a strong, enduring trust in God's goodness. They taught John and Heidi that there's a purpose in the pain, that in every situation, this is part of God's part, and we also look for our part. They taught them that we must be participants in the faith we profess and not just recipients of God's goodness. Faith itself is all about trust. It's easy to become discouraged when we're facing difficult issues. It's tempting to wonder if God really cares, if he hears our prayers. It's hard at times to hold on to his promises and not give in to discouragement. But something we need to remember is this. He saw us before we were ever born. Every day of our life was recorded in his book. Every moment was laid out before a single day had passed. His thoughts about us are precious and cannot be numbered. You see, there's nothing that is going on with us that God was not aware of before we breathed our first breath. None of the things we encounter or struggle with are a surprise to God. Nothing is going to happen to us today that he has not already written in his book. And there is nothing that is outside of God's control. He knows what is best and he will do what is best, even if it doesn't look like it at the moment. This is where we'll have to learn to rest and take courage, because discouragement will seek to shake our resolve. My conversation with Squally last Sunday afternoon caused me to refocus on how I was dealing with my own health issues. The issues aren't new. Those issues, they affected my sleep, my mobility, and having an increased level of neuropathy in my arms and my hands, and the pain level has greatly increased. For almost 47 years, I've had to deal with the pain at different levels. It resulted from an injury when I was still in the Army, but it was never treated. But you see, at 20 years old, you still think you're invincible. But when you hit your later 60s, you realize you're not. And I'm not one who is good at accepting help. I've always been the helper. It's always been hard for me to allow Linda to do what she had been asking me to let her do, and that was to help me. But when it got to the point I found I could not button my shirts or my pants, and I couldn't put my hearing aids in, I had to ask her for her help. I never let her drive. I always felt safer when I was driving. But we had an appointment in Jacksonville this past Tuesday, and for the first time I told her, I said, "Why don't you drive?" And she looked at me like, was I serious? But I said, "No, I think you need to drive," because I knew with the medication I'd been taking, which I was detoxing from, I didn't think it was good for me to get behind the wheel. And she drove there and back, and I did try to make sure I gave her some good instructions. We made it safely. You see, she's wanted to help me for a long time, but I wouldn't let her, because I didn't want to seem weak. Just the way I was brought up, we just don't let people help us. I told this in Sunday school this morning, and I remembered years ago when my papa died, Linda was trying to help my grandmother do some things around the house, and my grandmother wouldn't let her. So Linda looked at her and said, "Mama Vernon, do you remember how good it feels to help somebody else? The joy it brings you?" And she said, "Yes." And then Linda looked at her and said, "Well, you're robbing me of that joy right now. I just want to help you." And it got her attention. You know, it's funny how some of these things just kind of pop in your head. As I was reading about Abraham's test of faith, something came to mind that happened just before Abraham is asked to go and sacrifice Isaac. It's in chapter 21, verse 33. It says, "Then Abraham planted a tamarisk tree at Beersheba, and there he worshiped the Lord, the eternal God." Trees are a blessing in the desert. They not only provide shade from the scorching heat, they generally are connected to some source of water. The tamarisk tree is called salt cedar. It's a slow-growing tree which thrives in sandy soils with a higher saline content. And it's one of the few trees that is found around the shores of the Dead Sea. That tree can grow as high as 40 to 60 feet, has small leaves that excrete salt crystals from the soil, on its long tap roots. The salt on these leaves in turn absorbs the little moisture that's in the air, and as the water droplets evaporate from the leaves, the air beneath that tree is cooled. Shepherds and travelers in that area prize that tree. I said it was slow growing. When Abraham planted that tree, he knew he would never benefit from the shade it produced. His son Isaac would not have benefited from it either. But Isaac's children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and all of their future generations would benefit. The tamarisk tree was a symbol of Abraham's faith in God's promises to him. I will make you into a great nation, I will bless you, and I will make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who treat you with contempt. All the families on earth will be blessed to you and blessed through you. Abraham's trust enabled him to do just what God had asked, knowing God would provide just as he had promised. This week's been a better week for me, but it's also reminded me to go back and nurture my tamarisk tree, because somewhere along the way I stopped nurturing it and remembering the promises that I made and the promises that God made. May he find each of us faithful. Amen.